The Sportsman's Alliance of Maine welcomes you to Conserving the Maine Outdoors on Legacy 1160 WSKW. Now, here are David and Mike.
Welcome to Conserving the Maine Outdoors with David and Mike. This is now our fourth show, Mike, that we're doing?
Fourth show, yeah. Welcome.
And, well, thanks for listening to our show. Conserving the Maine Outdoors is a production of the Sportsman's Alliance of Maine. We welcome listeners, not just outdoors men and women, but all listeners to join our show. We talk about all kinds of things, not always outdoor related stuff, but
actually, our organization is involved in lots of things, not just hunting and fishing. We have conservation. We partner with many conservation groups to conserve land, other things. We have the Boy Scouts to our properties in Augusta, fishing in our pond, and just enjoying the Maine outdoors.
Absolutely. Well, we have one of my favorite people as a guest today. This gentleman came quite a ways. I tried to get him to tell me where he lived, but for some reason he wouldn't tell me. We can talk about that a little bit later. Jerry Levine is retired biologist with Inland Fisheries and Wildlife now, but he maintains his biology consulting business with us and in other areas. So he still practices as a biologist, and he's our go-to guy on all kinds of wildlife issues. And I've learned one thing with Jerry Levine is you just don't challenge his intelligence. He knows what he's talking about, and obviously I don't know enough about biology to challenge him. But we're going to be talking about, and we wanted to expand on something we did last week. We had mentioned that Inland Fisheries and Wildlife has a number of petitions brought by John Glower, the Maine Wolf Coalition director, to do a number of things, and we wanted to bring somebody on who knew what they were talking about, who could really not take apart, but show the other side of the issues when it relates to these three petition issues. Bear baiting's one of them, coyotes are another, and we'll get into the third one in a minute. But so Jerry's going to be talking about each component of the three petitions and maybe some issues around deer as well. So with that, Jerry, could you introduce yourself and then we can get started on this?
Sure. Thanks, David and Mike. I was a wildlife biologist, primarily the deer biologist for Maine Fish and Wildlife for 30 years, and it didn't take me too long after that, less than 2 years, to hook my wagon, hitch my wagon, so to speak, to the Sportsman's Alliance of Maine, because there was still a lot of things policy-wise that I knew needed to be done and could be done. And I've been with the Sportsman's Alliance in various capacities since 2007.
Wow.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on the show.
And for a time, I was on the board as well, and then got more involved in the consulting, the deer management initiatives that Sam has, and also among that, within that context, an impetus to try to increase the harvest of coyotes, not protect them or end their hunting and trapping.
Well, to that point, for an example of what Jerry has worked on with us, back in the last Land for Maine's Future bond package, Jerry was instrumental in drafting some language that changed that statute to prioritize the purchase of habitat for wildlife, particularly brook trout and white-tailed deer habitat in parts of the state of Maine where deer wintering areas have disappeared. And it led to, and this is a legacy maker, I think, and I'm going to give you almost all the credit for it, Jerry, and that is the Coldstream Project up in the Forks region. That was a significant purchase of both deer wintering habitat and some of the best brook trout spawning habitat in the state of Maine. And that was an example of that new LMF money and that new prioritization of wildlife habitat. And that language is still in the LMF statutes now. And last session, while that a renewal of the bonds was being considered, that language continued on. And I think that's a legacy maker, Jerry, because it really targets investments in wildlife habitat that's critical to certain regions of the state.
Yeah, that's I agree that and it's an important element because prior to that, most of the conservation efforts had to do with land and access and things like that, and with a deer population in the northern part of the state that is in such peril, we felt it was very important that some of this effort from LMF should go to ensuring that deer wintering habitat remains in perpetuity available to deer.
Yeah, I think the other piece that gets missed in this is that guiding, hunting, and fishing in certain regions of the state, because there's no manufacturing base, because jobs are so few and far between, are a major piece of the economy in those regions. I can think of places like Allagash, I can think of Jackman, down east, where deer are a staple to the economy in the region. And when the deer population crashes, the economy suffers. So it's not just, for us, it's prioritizing the purchase of deer and wildlife habitat, but it's also about preserving the culture and in I guess the economies of rural Maine. And for that, kudos to you, and we'll fight tooth and nail to make sure that continues in the future. So with that, I want to get into some of the other subjects. And before I do that, one of the things I'm going to be doing on future shows is mentioning some of our corporate sponsors. First of all, our membership make up our base, but we have some wonderful corporate sponsors, and I throw their names out there so folks know who supports us. I think the top one is LL Bean. They've supported us for years, and they support us with our youth programs. They fund most of the foundation that makes up our youth programs. Cabela's, Kittery Trading Post. There's more. Poland Spring has been a terrific sponsor of ours, and we work together on various things. I'll mention a few more a little later in the show, but I wanted to throw those names out there. So with that, last week we talked about a petition, 3 of them actually, that John Glowa has brought to Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and will be considered through the rulemaking process. I see recently he wrote a column in the KJ on the first one, and he's going to be pushing it hard, and that's related to what he calls feeding bears. We just had a referendum where there was an attempt to ban baiting, hounding, and trapping, and that failed at referendum. And now he's going after each individual thing one at a time through the rulemaking process. I don't think any sportsman out there, a woman, should consider him a friend of sportsmen. Just the opposite. Every time I see him in front of the legislature, he's railing against sportsmen and against hunting. Just recently, there was an LMF bond, and he helped spearhead 56 people testifying in opposition to LMF, which is a very popular program. And their biggest concern was they did not want hunting, fishing, and trapping to be required when lands are purchased by the state. That, if you take sportsmen and women out of the equation, you lose a pretty big base of land users, and that should tell you right there that Mr. Glower is not a friend of sportsmen. So with that, I want to start with the bear one, and I'll read a little bit of right out of the rulemaking process. He attempts to establish a bear feeding season in statute. Says that there's no definition of that. He wants to phase out the baiting of bears. He wants to GPS their sites. Just a whole number of regulations that would eliminate baiting as a management tool. And Jerry, if you could talk a little bit about, and I know you know the subject pretty well because you helped advise us when the referendum was going on, and talk about the bear population and why that's a management tool we need to keep in place.
Well, put this in context. The Fish and Wildlife Department just completed a revised management plan for the black bear, as well as for deer and moose and wild turkey. And during the process, with public input and so forth on this plan, the department recognized that the bear population continues to grow. The bear population could, in fact, become become a nuisance very quickly if the population continues and it exceeds its food supply. And that hunting of bears is absolutely critical for at least trying to limit population growth. It can't be done any other way. Baiting of bears is the primary method that the state endorses for hunters to take bear during the course of the fall hunting season. The other method is the use of dogs, and there's also a third method, trapping. A small number of bears also are shot incidentally as they are encountered by hunters during deer season, but that's a tiny amount of it. Bear baiting is overwhelmingly the primary method to harvest bears. Mr. Glowa's recommendations would eventually phase all of baiting out. And in fact, he alleges that the baits that hunters use, such as donuts and bakery goods, are toxic to bears. They're unhealthy for bears. You would think that bears could regulate their own diet and they would know what's good for them. And they wouldn't eat it if it wasn't good for them, believe me.
Sure.
But no, he presumes to tell us that this type of bait and everything that goes with it is unhealthy for the population.
Yeah.
His real focus is to end the hunting of all wildlife species, and this is his effort to end the hunting of bears in Maine. And Maine has one of the largest black bear populations in North America, and without the ability to hunt them, hunters and non-hunters alike would be in trouble.
There's a piece of this that I think we all should say this, qualify this, that I'm not assuming that people don't understand all of Maine, because many Maine residents, non-residents, they travel throughout the state and they understand it. So when I say this, I don't mean it like I know more about northern Maine than anybody else. But it's been my experience, having been a logger for over 30 years as well, I understand the industry. When you're recreating in southern Maine and you're using state hiking trails, you see these well-manicured, really nice, healthy, mature forests. When you get up above Bangor, it's a different type of harvest that goes on. There's industrial forests. The landscape changes dramatically, and that landscape, what happens is that it's an industrial forest and it's more heavily logged. So what you have is younger, very dense forest, a lot of 10 to 15-year-old growth that you can't even really push your body through it. It's perfect bear habitat. So in those regions of the state, the methods that he talks about using in his petition are scents and calls for bears. Those two types of techniques may work well in Oregon or Washington State, where you have large open areas. But in Maine, it's almost impossible to do those things. So much of the premise of his replacement strategies just don't work here in Maine. And so I encourage people to do their own homework. Trying to go into a 5-6 million acre area that is a commercial forest regrowth, it's nearly impossible to hunt by these methods.
And make no mistake about it, this would only be the first step in a long list of strategies that Mr. Glowa and all of his allies would implement to eventually completely eliminate hunting. That's their goal. And within this context, as the Fish and Wildlife Department ponders these proposed rule changes, I would dearly hope that they do not just approve one or two elements of this proposal or the other proposals just to appease these people, because organizations who want your complete demise will not stop with just a couple of appeasing sops to their proposal. Once they get to step 1, they're going to go to step 2, and then step 3, and step 4, until we have no hunting left.
That's that whole death by 1,000 cuts strategy.
What, Jerry? What do you? Do we know approximately how many black bears there are in the state of Maine right now?
That's pretty contentious, and it's subject to being abused and overused. The latest department estimates are in the vicinity of 45,000, and they recognize that the bear population continues to grow.
And what would happen if we just eliminated bear hunting?
Well, if we eliminate the 2,000 or 3,000 bear that are harvested, some of that mortality would occur naturally, but very little of it. So the population of bears would increase. The average age of bears would increase, and that means that with a large number of older bears in a population, you're going to find an increase in predation on deer, fawns, and moose calves. You're going to see an increase in, because food is relatively less available to a larger population, you're going to see bears starting to raid houses, crops, beehives, and that type of thing to a greater degree. This is not theoretical. New Jersey had, for a long time, eliminated bear hunting. And in that very populous state, the bear population had gotten to the point where it was extremely big, a big nuisance problem, including the killing of at least one individual person in an act of predation. So this is not theoretical stuff, because we can see what happens in other states who lost their ability to manage their bear population.
Yeah.
I remember back several years ago when we were in the legislature, they were talking about the food supply for the bears to be fairly critical at that time, and I think the numbers were even lower than the total bear population. So at some point in time, when we keep having increases in population of bears, and even if, say, the food stayed stable, eventually they're just going to start to go hungry, and that's what would drive them to.
Yeah. When I was a very young biologist in 1975 and 76, the first job I had with the department was to begin trapping and tagging bears on the very first 2 years of the bear research study. And that research continues to this day, some 45 plus years later. And so Maine knows a lot about its bear population and how it would react. Around the year 1980 or so, they estimated something on the order of 15,000 bears. Around 2000, they estimated 23,000. 20 years later, they're estimating about 45,000. So there's a real trend of increasing bear population.
You know, one of the points that John Glowa likes to make, and I want to get back to the predation issue in just a moment, but he makes a point that all of this food is going into the woods and somehow raising the bear population. Having lived in Maine so far my entire life, and having traveled around the state to Moosehead, when I was a kid, we didn't have landfills. We had open dumps where literally everyone in the town just took all of their junk to the dump, and you just piled it in a big heap. You could go up to Moosehead, up to their landfill. I'll call it landfill. Now it's politically correct, but back then it was the dump. And you could sit there in the evening, and bears would come in all around you and feed right in front of you in the dump. Well, you had hundreds of these dumps all over the state of Maine, open feeding areas. Using his logic, we should have had 45,000 bears when I was a kid, and that was a long time ago.
That's right. I can add to that, because during those first 2 years of the bear research study, we tried to, and we did, we put tags on bears in Baxter Park. Baxter Park also had those open dumps. The director of the Baxter Park at the time required us, the bear crew, to have someone in place 24 hours a day while we had those foot snare traps out. So one of us had to sleep in a wall tent at the dump all night with bear after bear lifting its nose under the tent and sniffing, to see what's going on. We didn't get much sleep, but we caught a lot of bears.
I can tell you that when I was a kid and we were out in the woods, and every time we heard a raccoon or a squirrel, it was a bear. And they scared that. So I appreciate exactly what you're talking about. It's terrifying to think that you got a bear literally 2 feet from you. I do want to get back to the predation issue for a minute, because I said something that my previous director, George Smith, quoted me on. I was on the IF&W committee, and we were talking about the impact of predation by coyotes. And the subject was brought up, and I think it was from information you had put forward, Jerry, around the fact that bears are as significant a predator on white-tailed deer as coyotes. And at the time, I said ignoring the predation by bears is like standing on the gallows and ignoring the hangman if you're trying to bring the deer population back. And that was a quote that they used in the Sam News at the time. But I think that people, they look at the predation on deer around the state, and they forget about how big of an impact bears have. And that was at a time when we had 20,000 bears. I think it's time to do a study to find out what the impact is. People are screaming at me all the time from northern, eastern, and western Maine to bring the deer herd back. Well, how can you bring the deer herd back when you have the coyote and now the bear in such significant numbers, really putting a hurt on the deer population? So it's something that should be addressed. It needed to a long time ago, and I wanted you to speak to that a little bit too.
Several things about predation on deer fawns. When the bears come out of hibernation in the spring, they have a real need to have protein to replace their body losses over the course of the winter. And years and years ago, before there were coyotes, it was interesting that when biologists went to deer yards to do dead deer surveys and essentially count bodies in the 50s and 60s, early 70s, every deer carcass that we saw that was killed by bobcat or starved was already being mauled on or pawed apart by bears looking for some protein. When we had a spring season for bear hunting, and the same is true for on Indian land in Maine as well as in Ontario, New Brunswick, they use meat during the spring hunt as the bait because bears need that protein early on. So when the deer fawns begin to drop around the first week in June and for a month, bears as well as coyotes focus on that resource for them to try to augment their nutritional demand for protein. And where there is a lot of bears and a lot of coyotes, we lose a lot of deer fawns. This information is kind of dated now. It's prior to 2005. But when I was a deer biologist, we were able to get estimates of the amount of fawn loss. Northern Maine and eastern Maine lost about half, sometimes more than half, of their fawns every year, every summer. And southern Maine lost only about a third or a quarter of them. And the difference is we had coyotes everywhere, but we didn't have bears everywhere. And so you see part of that. In other states and provinces who studied this, they found that not only did bear and coyote have an impact on populations, but their impact was about equal. So if we're losing 50% of our fawns, close to half of them are going to bears, close to half are going to coyotes, and a few other sources of mortality, including bobcat or fox.
I'm going to share with you a story that I believe the gentleman's name was Naaman Pratt. He did some photography for us for a while, and during the bear referendum, he had some photographs of black bears that he had witnessed killing fawns. He'd actually taken photos. They were pretty graphic, something that we probably wouldn't share on here some of the photos because it was pretty sad and emotion generating for the general public. But he shared with me a story around filming black bears in national parks. Well, first of all, for the listeners, I believe the black bear's nose is 8 times more powerful than a bloodhound, and they can smell feed from 20 miles away. They are one of the few animals that can find a fawn in a thicket. And he talked to me about how he'd watch bears come in every day while the fawns are being dropped in a certain area, and they learned to use a grid pattern. The bears would move back and forth in the brush in a grid pattern until they could find a fawn. And they would stay there until the fawns were old enough to escape them. But for that 2 or 3 week period, that's all they hunted was fawns, and he watched them, he filmed them. So I think as we talk about biology and inland fisheries and wildlife particularly, and how they manage wildlife, they understand those things. They're not driven by emotion. They're not animal rights. They're not sportsmen's groups. They're biologists. And their job is to strike a balance with the predation, keep all of the wildlife populations in check so that each can exist in balance. And when you start to manage any kind of wildlife on emotion, taking away tools for biologists to manage properly, you create an imbalance. And some people, and this is important, I think, key. Some people understand that if they can create an imbalance, then hunters may not be needed in the future. That's using biology for a political agenda, not management. And with that, we're going to move on to another segment and another petition that's being brought by the same individual. It's coyotes. This one in particular is highly controversial and something we really need to talk about.
Conserving the Maine Outdoors.
Welcome back to Conserving the Maine Outdoors with David and Mike. We have our special guest, and we'll be talking with Jerry Levine, retired deer biologist with Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and now consulting biologist for the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. Real quick, I want to mention a couple more of our corporate sponsors that just have been terrific to our organization. Robbins Lumber, Shipyard Brewing Company, Waste Management, particularly right now, they're doing a lot with us on our youth land management program that we're working on, and Wyndham Weaponry. So we're going to be talking in a few minutes about redefining the coyote as a subspecies of the wolf. I think this is really up Jerry's alley. He knows his stuff on this, and I want to get right to that. And then we'll talk a little bit about trapping. And then we'll wrap it up with talking about some deer wintering areas around the state and the health of our deer yards around the state right now.
With that, though, we better throw in a plug for the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. You can join us. We're strongest with membership. So it's sportsmansallianceofmaine.org, or you can call the office to join, 623-4589. And we have some good benefits of being a member. We work really hard to keep the outdoor tradition of Maine lively, and we have youth programs at our property here in Augusta with a fishing pond and hiking trails and camping areas, and the Cabela's discount. We can't forget about that. That's 20% off a lot of your Cabela's purchases. Right off the bat, you could save more than what the membership costs you on one trip to Cabela's. Back to David.
All right. Well, let's get right into this stuff. Well, before I do that, I think you'll see that we now have some video that we're running along with a radio program. I guess we've graduated from the farm team up into the JVs, and we're almost we're almost into varsity. We'll see down the road. It looks like I was the only one who got the memo that we're to dress up in our nice. I'm all color coordinated here, and I see Mike's trying to hide in his camo, and
I got
Jerry's
my camo hat on.
And but at least Jerry got the color coordination right.
Yes, and I also brought my black fly lights as well.
Goodness.
So,
you look like you've been shot with a bird.
I'm color coordinated as well.
Yeah, you're covered. So we do have a serious subject to talk about, and I think probably the most dangerous of all three petitions that John Glower has introduced through the rulemaking process at Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and that is to redefine the coyote. And I'm not going to make believe I'm an expert on this one. I'm going to hand this one right to Jerry, because I think the information you have to provide in our valuable time, you ought to have an opportunity to explain how damaging that would be to our state.
Sure. Glower's proposal, I think we should go through all the different elements of it first,
sure.
and then I'll broaden it out to describe what they're really up to.
Okay.
As David said, the first thing they want to do, they want to change the legal definition of a coyote.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, they're called eastern coyotes. The Latin name is Canis latrans, and it's the same Latin name as the coyote out west. So the federal government and everybody else makes no distinction between our coyote here in the Northeast and the coyote out west. The second thing they want to do, they want to prohibit coyote killing contests, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But that's element number 2. They want to establish closed seasons for daytime coyote hunting, and they prohibit the killing of any coyote over 40 pounds, as if you can tell what they are. They also require that all coyotes now be tagged, and they want to prohibit all baiting of coyotes and promote the protection and survival of wolves. So that's the proposal the department's got to address. If this organization, if Glower's organization succeeds at this, it would essentially end all coyote hunting in the state of Maine. With a limit of 40 pounds on being able to harvest a coyote, hunters cannot discern coyote size out in the field like that. It just can't. They just cannot do it.
Can I jump in right here, Jerry? Because I want to talk about that for a second. I've seen a lot of coyotes in my life. I've hunted them. I can't, to be honest with you, when I'm out, because coyotes are so wily, they're always moving. I think it's virtually impossible to say, hey, that's a 28-pound coyote, or that's a 42-pound coyote. Where in the world would he come up with something like that, and why would he come up with something like that?
Well, let's talk about the size of our eastern coyote. I now have records of over 650 coyote weights taken in the state of Maine, primarily from the weights at coyote contests on reliable scales, where they weigh every coyote killed, not just the big ones, not just the good-looking ones, every coyote. The winter weights of coyotes in Maine ranges from 15 pounds for some late-born pups, all the way up to 48, almost 50 pounds for very large mature males. A small percentage of them are 40 pounds and older. It's rare to get a female coyote that's even over 40 pounds. What Glower's up to, though, his background is trying to promote wolf reintroduction in Maine, and also he's convinced that wolves, even though they have not crossed the St. Lawrence River and come into Maine from northern Quebec in a century, he's convinced they're going to do it. He's also convinced that he wants the federal government to do a reintroduction program. But the 40-pound distinction is he believes that any coyote over 50 pounds is probably a wolf. And we have not seen coyotes over 50 pounds. We simply have not. But that's where he's at. But first he wants to clear the field by making it illegal to shoot anything that looks like a wolf. Our coyotes have a small amount of wolf DNA, 14 to at most 30% wolf DNA. They acquired that wolf DNA a century ago when coyotes came across the southern Great Lakes area, interbred with the remnant wolf populations in Minnesota, and and then moved on to the east. This happened in the 1920s and 30s. The first coyotes we saw here in Maine, we didn't see any until the 40s, and we didn't see any in numbers until the 70s when they filled in and became populated and adjusted to life here in Maine. There are now coyotes all over the Northeast, including all the Canadian provinces that surround us. But Mr. Glauer wants to first clear the field, make it illegal to coyote hunt, and then begin efforts to either reintroduce wolves or consider this coyote that we have, as David mentioned earlier, a subspecies of the wolf, and then apply for federal protection under the Endangered Species Act to eliminate all hunting and trapping of them. That's where he's going, and they've now revealed their hand in that way.
Well, I think on an earlier show, I know on an earlier show we talked with Dave Sullivan, who represented the Lobstermen's Union here in Maine, and we saw and we heard from him a first-hand experience how the Endangered Species Act in right whales is being used to shut down lobstering in the state of Maine, or at least an attempt through the courts. I think this is the key point here. If you can drag the coyote, which is heavily populated, not under any kind of risk, gets hunted year-round, and still continues to have a healthy population and growing everywhere, the real motive here is to get the coyote into a position so that it can be used in the Endangered Species Act to shut down other activities. It's the same way with the lynx, the right whale, and that's the danger, I think, in what's happening with the animal rights movement, is that they're taking a perfectly good intentioned law, the Endangered Species Act, and using it, and their only advantage they have is money, to use the courts to shut down the things that they want to shut down.
They have a lot of money, definitely. I wonder, too, quick question, Jerry, about trying to bring this full circle with deer hunting. I wonder if and I can't say I can get into John Glower's mind by any stretch of the means, but I wonder if he's going to try someday to loop this in with deer hunting, saying that there's plenty of predation out there once we have wolves and coyotes running the whole state here. Bears. If we're going to start reducing, deer hunting in general, like shortened seasons, less doe permits.
Well, with wolves in other states, under the Endangered Species Act, it's one of their key strategies to allow hunting of deer and moose only if there's enough prey for the wolf. The reverse of what we're seeing now.
Right.
Here. So that does enter into it. I'd like to point out, though, that Glauer is only the tip of the iceberg, and that this is a more detailed and coordinated effort by a lot of organizations who are quietly trying to promote this eastern coyote as a new species of wolf. All the way back to 2014, there was a show that came out on PBS on the nature program called The Coy Wolf. And it was an hour-long show that took millions of dollars, I'm sure, to produce. And it portrayed the coyote now, the eastern coyote, as the new wolf. And they kind of hid the fact that, or didn't play up the fact that this critter has been here for a century, and they portrayed it as something new. And with all these organizations who spent decades telling us that coyotes only eat mice and crickets, they now are saying, yeah, they're important deer predators and this, that, and the other thing. They're trying to transition our coyote into a top-level predator for the Northeast. And along the same line, people other than Glauer are petitioning the authorities who do this type of thing to actually change the scientific name of the eastern coyote from Canis latrans to Canis oriens, which means eastern dog or eastern canid. And if they succeed in getting this thing called a coy wolf Canis oriens, then they will have standing with the federal government for a whole separate species to petition for protection under the Endangered Species Act. And a species does not have to be actually low or rare in abundance or in danger of extinction to be put on the Endangered Species Act. Just look at what they did with the lynx here for the last 20 years. You know, an abundant lynx population got put on the list for political reasons and not for biological reasons. And we're stuck with it. They're looking to do the same thing here with the coy wolf.
Well, when I was working on the bear referendum, I did a tremendous amount of research into the Humane Society of the United States, and one of the main tenets of their approach to wildlife management is using predators instead of humans to manage wildlife. And I think that's part of the overall agenda, and it has been. And I can take credit for, and I'm pretty proud of this, when I pointed out that at the time of the referendum that the Humane Society's position on hunting was that they opposed all forms of hunting. They had an actual position on their page. And when I beat that up enough politically, right in the middle of the referendum, they pulled it from their website and had a nice little politically correct statement in its place. And so, folks, you can hide. You can move this stuff around your website, but there are still people around who remember. And we're going to be able to talk about it in places like this radio station, and just not forget that. And this is the part where I jump in and say, please make sure when I talk about the Humane Society of the United States, I'm not talking about your humane shelters locally. They take good care of our animals. They're always looking out for animal welfare. Please don't take my comments as too critical to the humane societies locally. This is the Humane Society of the United States.
Totally different organization.
Yeah, but they are savvy, and they're getting better all the time in their messaging. Mm-hmm. And they really proved it when they took their anti-hunting stance down off their national website, because these folks in Maine.
I wonder if they've ever been out to a site where a coyote or other animal has taken down a deer. And or a pack of coyotes.
Yeah. Or in a case like when I was a state senator, I had a lady from North Waldoboro called me and said 2 coyotes just chased my 2 cats up onto the porch and killed one right in front of me, and I barely saved the life of the second one.
When I was up north snowmobiling, I saw many areas where you'd come across an area, you'd see just basically bones, some fur, and a bloodbath, and it was a big, like a big, huge area, 30, 40 feet, around, and it just, you could tell that the deer was just torn to shreds live.
Oh, yeah, and to that point, when you bring that to the attention of these very same people, they'll say, well, that's nature.
Yeah.
Right.
But then they'll turn around and say, oh, we don't want humans hunting for sustenance. We don't want you killing deer. But isn't that nature? We're being taken out as the top predator in the environment, and I think that's really the agenda here. With that, we're going to run out of time if I don't get a chance to jump into the... he does have, Mr. Glower does have another petition, and that would ban trapping, and we don't have coyote trapping in particular. We don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but Jerry, if you want to speak to that real quickly, I want to save some time to talk about deer.
This thing to ban all coyote trapping, and he says because it's cruel and inhumane, it ties in with the other part of ending coyote hunting over bait and other things. It's to set the groundwork for protecting the coyote under the federal list or introducing wolves. And eliminating trapping is a necessary step for that.
Yeah. I wouldn't have had as much concern over a wolf introduction in the past, but now as we're moving into national monuments and national parks, those are the places that wolves are introduced nationally. If you see wolves being reintroduced, it's usually in a national park or on reservation lands in cooperation with tribes. Going forward, for me, one of the sensitive areas is if there's an expansion of our current national monument, is there the potential for an introduction or a redesignation of the national monument if it grows into a national park? Because that would be a perfect location to introduce wolves.
Well, tied into that also is if the legal status of Maine's Indian tribes changes and they come under federal law, then all of the Indian lands would be candidates for wolf introduction. They would be candidates for that, and the state of Maine, the way things are put together now, would be powerless to change or stop that. And yet, once the wolves are here, the wolves are going to determine where they're going to go. And in fact, around the turn of the century, the department assigned me to do an in-depth look at what wolf introduction would be like. And here are two conclusions. One is that we would not have deer in the northern half of the state, because there's nowhere in the range of wolves that has deer and wolves with this much snow that we get. The second thing is wolves would travel the spine of the Appalachians all the way from Baxter Park down into Georgia, and there would be no way to stop them. So the last thing we want to do is support introducing wolves anywhere, and if other agencies like tribes or the federal government do it on their own, we're all in big trouble.
Yeah, and that leads into the upcoming election cycle. There was a bill in this last legislative session that would basically give all authority under the federal agreements, tribal agreements, and eliminate all state oversight of wildlife management on tribal lands. In addition, it allowed tribes to purchase land outside of their traditional properties or lands that they had traditionally. And so that was viewed as a very dangerous bill. I hated to get up there and testify against the tribes. I did it several times. It took a lot of abuse for that. Personally, I was accused of being racist because I didn't support the tribes, and that word is very powerful now, and it can be used to silence critics, but that is a very dangerous bill. And
that bill has not gone away. Huh?
It has not, and it will not go away. They're still working on it. It will be part of our legislative questionnaire cycle this year. We want to know what legislators support such a thing. I point there's one last thing out. I want to get into deer, is that I get up in front of the IF&W committee and I walk them down the path of how, if they pass that tribal bill, that open pit mining would be legal in the state of Maine, something the legislature just said no to a few years ago, and how the state would be powerless to regulate or stop it. It would all be done under federal regulation. That opened some eyes, and some folks came up to me afterwards and thanked me for that testimony. So with that, I want to jump right into deer, because right now, Jerry, as far as I'm concerned, you're the foremost expert on deer wintering areas, and you have the historic value, the historic experience of I think you were here in the state managing when we had a healthier deer yards, a healthier on the landscape percentage of deer wintering areas out there, and a lot's changed over the years, and I wanted you to talk about how important that piece is to the management of white-tailed deer.
You know, it says a lot for an investor to get out of the market at the right time. Yeah, and I retired in 2005 when deer were pretty much at their peak, and a lot of events have occurred since then that have worked against deer survival, particularly in the northern part of the state. There are two elements to this. One is that where winters are severe and prolonged, having the right types of forest cover in place for deer to use in the wintertime is absolutely crucial for their survival, because dense softwood forests reduce snow depth, they reduce the ability of predators to take them down, and they provide a better microclimate for them to survive cold temperatures. And the department has had a focus, at least from the 50s, to try to preserve a certain amount of it, and they've done it this way and that way, and not every way fits for all locations, but it still remains crucial that we preserve and improve deer wintering habitat in the northern half of the state and in the south. But severe winters occur in southern Maine only 1 year in 10. Only 1 year in 15 do winters get mild in northern Maine, so they're crucial up north. The other element to this, you can have all the shelter in place that you want, but if you want to minimize deer mortality, you also have to reduce the predation element as well. And with the arrival of the coyote in the early 1970s, it became absolutely apparent that winter mortality increased, almost doubled from what it was before the coyotes. So given any degree of winter severity in the presence of coyotes in the winter yards, their deer losses are much higher. Turn that around, the prescription for improving deer survival not only is preserving that habitat mix, but also getting in there and reducing coyote abundance at a time when deer are vulnerable. And with Sam, we've tried to promote both elements to this, and particularly by increasing hunter participation and excitement about hunting coyotes. And we wanted to make coyote hunting something akin to bear hunting as the next big thing for an economic as well as a functional biological strategy for improving deer survival.
Well, I don't know what the future is going to look like when it comes to deer wintering areas. I know I have my personal feelings, and as SAM director, I advise the board. I particularly like the idea of purchasing the deer wintering areas and managing them long-term for deer wintering areas. Forests change, forest landowners change, and oftentimes the agreements that are struck with companies, 5 years later they're sold, and so it's hard
that
to...
was the problem.
Yeah.
Remember, we were on the deer task force when we were in the legislature together, and that was one of the big issues that we had. The companies would agree to preserving the major deer wintering areas, and then the property would be sold.
Yeah, and then you have to start out with a whole new agreement, and oftentimes they're in conflict with the varying companies.
And what it comes down to is that managing forests for deer survival, for wintering habitat, is costly.
It is.
You can't cut it all at once. You have to preserve a certain amount of that landscape in good quality saw log spruce and fir, which is a valuable timber resource for companies. There's a limit to how much you can tell a company or a landowner how much money to lose by holding that forest for another 30 years and having some of it die off. So the best strategy is to have the state own it and manage it as they do with other public lands, so that the state, the people of Maine, pay some of that cost of intensive management of deer yards, which means keeping roads in good shape, which means going in and cutting only a little bit instead of all of it, and diversifying age classes, have some of each type in there. All of that is costly for private landowners, and to a degree they balk at doing it. If you require it legally, they may find a way around it. So it's a conundrum that is best solved, as David mentioned, by having public ownership of this important resource.
I think we're running a little bit low on time, but I did want to ask you about a lot of people in I'm from southern Maine, and I see an awful lot of deer driving home from work. I work second shift. I usually come home around 10, and there's deer all over the place. Maybe you can explain to people that don't get up in eastern or northern Maine the differences between populations between southern Maine and eastern and northern Maine.
Sure, and the whole thing comes back down to the severity of winters. In the southern part of the state, you might lose 5% of the population. In the northern part of the state, you might lose 25% each and every winter. And when mortality in the wintertime is that low, then it's easy for the department to manage for higher deer populations. And right now, with the any deer permit system we have in place, the department has, you can dramatically increase the number of permits to increase the doe harvest to bring the population down, or you can go the other way and be very conservative with permits and allow the population to grow. We've got that capability in the southern part of the state simply because the non-hunting mortality, the winter and predation mortality, is less abundant, and that gives deer managers greater control.
Right. Well, with that, I think we're pushing up against the clock. I wanted to thank Jerry for coming in. I really do appreciate the vast knowledge that you have on biology issues, and particularly in deer. And I'd love to have you back in the future. Maybe we can do another segment as it gets closer to hunting season and when people are really paying attention. But I do want to get into habitat. There's a lot going on in the landscape related to deer plots, they call them, or feed plots, whatever you want to call them. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of management going on regionally through predation control as well as changing the landscape for wildlife. With that, one last thing. Right now, it's 86 degrees outside, and weather has really changed. I live down on the coast. Just an update to the listeners that the alewives are in and running now, and fiddleheads are at the end of their. They're all coming up. There's still a few places left where they're coming up, but we're now transitioning into one of the best times of the year. I know the virus is an issue, but the summertime is coming, and fishing and outdoor stuff. So go out and enjoy it. Things are happening, and the weather's getting better, and there seems to be a little bit of hope on the horizon that this virus might be in our rearview mirror in the near future. Let's just all cross our fingers and hope. With that, this is a production of the Sportsman's Alliance of Maine, Conserving the Maine Outdoors with David and Mike. Thank you, Jerry. We hope that you'll listen to us every week. We're on Fridays at noontime, and if you really want this show to continue, consider joining the Sportsman's Alliance of Maine. You can do that at sportsmansallianceofmaine.org.
The Sportsman's Alliance of Maine presents Conserving the Maine Outdoors. Become a member today at sportsmansallianceofmaine.org.